Our last lecture, ocean floors and coastal areas. Before we get into the PowerPoint, it's good to review over this. And this is the whole process of what happened with North America. Make sure my camera is focused on the dry erase board. A little bit of a glare here. So the thing to keep in mind is at one time Pangaea, the big supercontinent, existed. 200 million years ago, Pangaea rifts apart. North America separates from Europe and Africa. Two small continents appear, Eurasia and Gondwanaland. Gondwanaland consists of South America, Africa, Australia, Antarctica. And then Antarctica and Australia are going to break away. And a small piece of that is going to break away. It's a microcontinent called Erosion. That's going to come all the way across the Pacific Ocean on a plate called the Farallon Plate, and it's going to attach itself up to the North American continent. So in the middle of the Mesozoic, when Pangaea broke apart, there was no Western United States, or it did exist, but it was somewhere else. What today is California, Nevada, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia was actually a part of the Australian continent, a lot of it, and some of it is going to be formed because of sediments that are going to erode off the continent. So in the Mesozoic, the edge of the North American continent was probably about the California-Nevada border. And because this Farallon Plate subducts, it goes underneath the North American continent, it brings with it a bunch of those small little pieces of rhodium. At the same time, erosion is taking place, and sediments are deposited out here on this ocean floor. And all those sediments are going to be pushed back up onto the continent. And this whole process is what we call accretionary tectonic. So we're going to talk about that quite a bit. After the North American continent accreted all these exotic pieces of rhodia and sediments that had set off into the ocean, we overrode the spreading center about 27 million years ago, and that was the birth of the San Andreas Fault, which we still have today. So as the North American continent continues to move to the west, the San Andreas Fault is moving to the east. And that is kind of the history of North America. Kind of all. So Wegener recognized that this supercontinent existed just by the fossils, the matching geology, the matching mountain ranges. So this kind of goes full circle back to where we started at the beginning of the semester. So we started the semester a little bit different than we're ending. Obviously because of the coronavirus. Oh my God, what a terrible virus, huh? Originates in China, even though China denies it now. And soon spread throughout the world. And it certainly changed our way of life. We had to completely convert from face-to-face lectures to recording lectures, and then uploading that onto a Windows system, and then from a Windows system to MP4, and into a hosting site like YouTube or Vista or one of those sites. So it's been completely different. We tried to accommodate you the best we possibly could, but we are here, finally, at the end of the semester. Good or bad, indifferent, we're here, and we just have to make the best of it. So I did put the final exam review. It's on the Pages tab. It's also under Files as Final Exam Review. And hopefully they'll find useful information there. We are not going to do a comprehensive final, so we're not going to go all the way back to the first of the semester when we were actually here in the classroom. So with that, I want to get into the California and coastal geology. So ocean floors and coastal areas. So current topography, if you look at California, it's a whole sequence of what we call step-up terraces. And you can see that often with the right light. California right now is a whole sequence of, I'll use this dry erase board, of what we call step-up terraces. And what that is showing is that sea level either rose or the continent rose. So geologists first saw this. It was kind of puzzling because if you look at the coast of California, it looks like this. whole sequence of these terraces. This would be modern sea level today. Waves are now cutting into this cliff. But at one time, this is where the ocean was, and then it was up here. And so the step-by-step terraces will tell you one of two things happen. Either the ocean rose and then lowered, or the continent rose. Well, basically what's occurred here is that the continent has uplifted due to tectonics. So once a part of the seafloor uplifted due to tectonics, this is because that seafloor plate subducting, it was like a conveyor belt. So this plate is meeting North America, it's bringing these microcontinents with it, it's scraping off seafloor sediments, and everything is pushed on top of one another, and the result is that the entire western part of the North American continent uplifts. And as it uplifts these old terraces, these old seafloor decks that are now well above sea level. So we kind of have this little step-by-step terrace. So this is the Farallon plate. As it's subducting, it's taking all of the sediment that's eroding off the continent. This continent is being shipped out into the ocean. In addition to that, there's all these little microcontinents, part of Rhodia, that broke off from Australia and Antarctica. All of this stuff is just being shoved on the North American continent. This results in the formation of thrust faults, where we find older rocks being thrust up top on younger rocks. Those thrust faults are called blind thrust faults. They're responsible for some of the major earthquakes in California, such as the Northridge earthquake. They're being reactivated today because the San Andreas Fault is now pulling apart the North American continent. So this represents compression, two plates converging. The North American plate moving to the west, the Farallon plate, and all these little pieces of Rhodia and all the eroded material coming from the continent are moving east. So east meets west, continental collision, and uplift. Off the coast of Africa today, there are major windstorms that blow. And as these storms go out into the Atlantic Ocean, the velocity of the wind decreases, and it drops this sediment, very fine sand, which actually picks up off the sand dunes in the Sahara Desert, and this material is then deposited off the west coast of Africa out in the Atlantic Ocean. We see this going on today, and we see the same type of deposits that are being formed today in places like San Diego, and even in the Santa Ana Mountains. So geologists use this concept. The present, what we see going on today, is a key to the past. And that kind of works well here, and this is a good example of how we use that to reconstruct past environments. So in addition to all this material being eroded off, as this plate, this Farallon plate subducts, it goes underneath the North American continent. As it goes deep, it melts. It's taking down with it sedimentary rocks, which are going to metamorphose, which is what the Franciscan complex is. Catalina Island is part of this. It's a microcontinent that tried to subduct. They think it got caught in between a bunch of wet material, kind of got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. It tried to subduct, but instead it formed a sequence of rocks called the Franciscan assemblies, which are blue schist and green schist. As this plate melts, it's going to create magma bodies. These magma bodies are going to come to the surface and form volcanoes. Eventually, this magma body is going to cool underground, crystallize into igneous rock, and then later be uplifted into the current Sierra Nevada mountains of today. So the Sierra Nevada mountains, Yosemite, kind of formed from a fire than ice scenario, because after this rock gets uplifted, after it's cooled, it's then cut and carved by glaciers, which is kind of interesting. So in the typical sequence of events that we see today, we have all these mountains that have been uplifted, such as the San Gabriel Mountains, the San Bernardino Mountains. All along the coast of California, we find these uplifted mountains, and then we find basins, such as the San Fernando Valley, the LA Basin, where Los Angeles, Long Beach, Santa Monica lie. And so this is kind of a unique topography, because what's occurring today in California, we have remnants of the past, the uplifted mountains due to compression, continents coming together. We also see today these valleys, these big basins being formed, like the San Fernando Valley and the LA Basin. And we can attribute this directly to extensional tectonics, which is the opposite of compression, where the landscape is now being stretched. As it's stretched, these basins are downtrodden. All along the coast we see sea cliffs, so we don't have a coast like the United States on the eastern seaboard does. If you go to places like Virginia, along the eastern seaboard of the United States, they have these very long continental shelves that go out for quite some distance. Our continental shelves have now been shoved up onto the North American continent. So when you go down, up and down the coast of California, you'll see this sequence of shells, sandstones, some more shells, and even every now and then you'll see a layer of conglomerate. These are sediments that used to form out here, at one time were out here in the water, in the ocean. They have been, since then, been pushed up onto the North American continent. So that has resulted in a very unstable coastline. California coastline is very unstable, subject to landslides, and I'll show you some pictures of that. So here comes the Farallon Plate. Prior to this is compression. Now once the San Andreas Fault makes contact with the North American continent, which is the old East Pacific rise, it starts to stretch out the North American continent. A lot of the thrust faults that were formed during this compression time have been now reactivated by the San Andreas Fault. So the San Andreas Fault is kind of pulling those thrust faults apart. In some places where the San Andreas Fault does not move because it's bound between mountains, like around Coachella and in the Cajon Pass, those parts of the San Andreas Fault have a lot of compression. This is where the San Andreas Fault has little kinks and bends in it. And these areas, there's actually compression going on because as the continents move, they move unequally. This results in a buildup of pressure. So in the areas where the San Andreas Fault has these nice little kinks and bends in it, this is where it is building pressure. That tension is actually being compressed. And this is typically what's going on today. So this is the landscape that we're current today. So what's going to happen in the future? San Andreas Fault is going to continue to march to the east. It'll eventually be in Arizona someday. So up and down our coast, this is a typical coastline that we see. Very small area of beach and then a sea cliff. And these sea cliffs are made of marine sediments that at one time were formed offshore. So these offshore sediments have all been uplifted. And we see this sequence in California. And this is typical. So as you go up and down the coast of California, sea cliffs are the dominant landscape because this material has been thrusted upward. So here's the San Andreas Fault from out in space. You can see it's a nice linear feature. I actually drew the line in here, but you can see a huge separation between the San Gabriel Mountains and the San Bernardino Mountains over here. San Andreas Fault goes right through these, cutting this granitic block. The San Gabriel Mountains used to be down further here. They've been moved up to the north a little bit. In between those is the San Andreas Fault. So this is a kind of dangerous part of the San Andreas Fault, this part between Coachella and the Cajon Pass. Other places where the San Andreas Fault is pretty straight, has moved. Here's a nice little kink in the San Andreas Fault. This is actually near Crizzle, the Crizzle Plain, another area that has a lot of lock pressure. So LA Basin, Los Angeles, metropolitan Los Angeles, has a very high potential of a deadly earthquake because of the possibility of an earthquake occurring here in the Crizzle Plain or along this section of San Andreas Fault between basically the Imperial Valley and Cajon Pass. So inland lagoons are rare along the tectonic active margin. So we have one right along our coast near Huntington Beach. It's actually called Bolsa Chica. This is an area that does not match the rest of California. So if you go up to Northern California, go down to south of San Diego, the dominant topography, the dominant seashore you're going to see where the land connects with the ocean, is going to be a very dramatic cliff. Bolsa Chica is rare, and it exists because the Newport-Inglewood Fault, which some authors are now suggesting that the Newport-Inglewood Fault is an old part of the San Andreas Fault, or it was the original San Andreas Fault. It's still an active fault because it is moving as a stress reliever to the San Andreas Fault. But in the Newport-Inglewood Fault, which basically originates up just north of Hollywood, it goes through the Long Beach Basin, it goes through Seal Beach, down through Sunset Beach, and it travels right along the Pacific Coast Highway in Huntington Beach, and goes offshore again just past the pier, the Huntington Beach Pier. So this area has been stretched And that entire sea cliff that used to be there has been downdropped. And it's created a kind of unique setting, an inland lagoon. So the lagoon always had an inlet, or a billabong, as they say in Australia. Always had a little inlet. This actually was owned in the 1890s, late 1890s, early 1900s, as a gun club. They actually dammed off the river. They kept the ocean from going in, and people would go out there and shoot birds. It was kind of a club. There's actually probably a better picture of it. The goal is maybe to restore this wetland. It's been destroyed because of the gun club, and then all this region, this part of it is actually part of the oil company, so there's a lot of oil out here. So it's kind of a tug of war. Developers would like to develop this and put nice houses in here. That way people have a view of the lagoon and the ocean. Conservationists would like to see this set aside as an estuary, which is an important ecological system, because this is a rare view where you have water that runs off from the land, which is fresh water, mixes with ocean water. It's really important for migratory species, whales, and for birds. So there's a lot of, almost want to say that this is the sacrificial land. It's been sacrificed by the developers who want to build nice homes, oil company. And so the area that is set aside for conservation is this little area in the red right here. And this is part of the Bolsa Chica Ecological Preserve. One of the entrances is right off of Warner, and the other one is right off the Pacific Coast Highway. So this is, like I said, it's a unique area. This entire area has been downdropped. You don't find a cliff, a sea cliff along. Or even at Huntington Beach, you don't find the sea cliff. Main Street kind of gradually goes down to the pier. It's not like Corona del Mar, where you drive down, all of a sudden, boom, there's a huge cliff. This area exists because of extensive tectonics. The Newport-Inglewood Fault, which is a strike-slip fault, much like the San Andreas Fault, is stretching this landscape, and it's downdropping it. So this entire area has been downdropped, which then resulted in a unique ecological setting where seawater and freshwater intermix, forming these inland lagoons. You see a lot of these inland lagoons / billabongs along the eastern seaboard of the United States, because the eastern seaboard of the United States is not tectonically active. We find sea cliffs along most of our coast because we are still, and will be for some time, a very tectonically active coast. So marine terraces is basically what we find along our coast. These are soft sediments. They're not consolidated. It means they're not kind of cemented well together. They're very loose, and they've been uplifted. So they're out of equilibrium. They consist of very loose material, and that makes them very prone for destabilization through landslides. And especially when development takes place, we tend to put added weight. We add landscaping, which then adds water, and the water infiltrates into the sediment, which makes it far more vulnerable to failure to slides because of the human element of what's building. So unconsolidated meaning not cemented together. These are loose sediments, and it's very unstable. I mean, naturally these cliffs are unstable, and then when we develop them, they become far more unstable. Good example is the cliffs along Santa Monica. So this is actually the Pacific Coast Highway. This is right where Interstate 10 terminates, right at the Santa Monica Pier. And then this is the Pacific Coast Highway, which goes along the cliff here. This is very unstable. It's all fenced off. There's signs up there saying, unstable cliff face. And we've increased the instability of this region because we have developed it. So urban development, urban crawl, urban encroachment, whatever you want to call it, kind of aids in the failure of these cliffs. So this is kind of a diagram that kind of shows how these things look. So you have this modern sea cliff, and then you have these old sea cliffs. So at one time, this old sea cliff was down here. And so this entire area has been subject to tectonic uplift and very subject to erosion as a result. So these terraces are up to tectonic activity. The San Andreas Fault is now actively kind of pulling everything apart. They're exposed to wave cutting action. During high tides, these storm surges slam right into these cliff sides and it erodes it. It takes out the toe, the bottom of that hill, and then eventually it's going to slide in. And this kind of shows this circular action as waves come in. They actually cut away, and they'll actually create little sea cliffs, and then eventually that whole rock face is going to cave in. In the 110 class, we actually were able to take a field trip before campus closed down, and we went down to a little Corona tide pool, and there's a couple of neat little sea cliffs there, and some caves that are eventually going to result in the failure, and there's some big homes that sit right above that, and part of that property will fall off eventually into the ocean. So this is typically what we see on the coast of California, very dramatic cliffs. During high tide, the waves cut right into the cliffs. This material is all mixed up. It's been turned, it's been uplifted. It's really been subject to a lot of tectonics, very complex tectonic history behind it. This is down in Sunset Beach in San Diego. How these homes developed, very unstable sea cliff here. This is an area where the waves would crash up into the cliff. They built a parking lot, and then they put a break wall in here in order to stop the waves from eroding, and it's kind of a temporary fix. Along Santa Monica, very unstable. This is very loose sediment. You can see how there's little rills in here. They are cut basically during rainfall events. Another way that we impact these cliffs is we'll remove the vegetation, or there's a fire that removes the vegetation. Once the sediments are exposed, once the vegetation is removed, they're even more vulnerable to erosion and then failure because the rain impacts the sediment directly rather than having the vegetation absorb the impact of the rainfall. Typical what you see along coast, especially in California, we are basically a sea cliff. If you go down a little Corona tide pool, you'll see these little sea stacks. This is an erosional remnant of once was a part of the continent. So at one time, this continental landmass extended all the way up to here. It has been since then cut back and eroded by the wave action. And this little sea stack here is basically a remnant of the old sea coast where it used to extend out further. So up and down the coast, here's a couple of those little sea stacks. So at one time, the coast was all the way out to here. Since then, because of wave action, it's been cut backwards. So during high tides, the waves are cutting right against these cliffs. And what occurs is that these cliffs will then break off in pieces. And up and down our coast of California, this is the dominant landscape, is sea cliffs. The sediment is very vulnerable. This is actually south of San Clemente. They were going to develop this area, so what do developers do? They go on bulldozers, they grade everything down flat. They remove all the vegetation. Well, before they could build, it rained. And because there was no vegetation, the runoff was incredible. It actually cut down through these sediments, created kind of like what's called a badland. And there are homes in San Clemente today that are what we call red tag. You cannot obtain a mortgage for one of those homes. Nor could you ever buy mortgage insurance or homeowners insurance because those homes are so vulnerable that no insurance company will even touch them. And so this is a good example of where we build, where we shouldn't build. And this is why you need to look at geology and understand the geological setting. So San Clemente, these homes are built right along this very unstable sediment. This is mostly sandstones, some shells, a little bit of conglomerates. During high tide, the waves are right against this cliff, eroding away. So it's a matter of time before this cliff facing fails. These homes have already lost part of their lawn, their backyards basically. And it's just a matter of time before the house also falls victim to the process of erosion. So here, these are what we call truncated headlands, Point Reyes. And so the landscape goes off and then boom, dramatic cliff. And that's because wave action is cutting across this, constantly eroding every day, every hour of the day. The waves are cutting this, making this very unstable. As these waves cut, they're going to result in little remnants, sea stacks, and so forth. And so this next question is why do we have sand on our beaches? So sand on beaches is very important. I've been to a lot of seminars where people try to explain what happened to the sand or what is occurring with our sand. Currently, our beaches throughout the western United States are eroding. We're losing our beaches. Now, I've been to some lectures where they try and attribute that erosion to raising sea level or advances at sea level, hence higher waves because of an increase in sea level are eroding the beaches. The problem with that hypothesis is there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that it is occurring or even to back up such a claim. So what is happening to our beaches today is we are losing our beaches. That is certainly a fact. And with the scientific method, you need to look at the truth, what's really occurring. Once you understand the true concepts, and not the fake ones, the true concepts, then you can take steps to remediate the wrong and to try and correct the problem. We're not doing that right now. We're trying to blame it on climate change. So it's climate change. It's one of those things like, well, blame it all on climate change. And it's a really good scapegoat if people buy into it, primarily because they don't have the background and the information to know what's really going on, especially with respect to climate. So active river systems such as the Santa Ana River, the Los Angeles rivers, and all the tributaries are always carrying sediment, quartz. So within granitic rocks, igneous rocks, there's quartz. And quartz is very resistant to the breaking. Notice, it won't break down. It'll weather into smaller pieces, but chemically, silica and oxygen will not fall apart because of the very strong covalent bond. That's a good thing. If silica and oxygen did not have that covalent bond, where those outer orbitals, those electrons overlap, we would not have any quartz sand at all. In fact, Earth would become very unstable because that is a binding element to a lot of rocks. So as granitic rocks start to weather, and you go further away from the source, as you go from the mountains down to the valleys and eventually to the ocean, that sediment gets finer and finer and finer until by the time it reaches the coast, it's pretty sand size. And so that sand is then discharged out into the Pacific Ocean. And then the longshore currents distribute that sand up and down the coast. And the waves then deposit the sand onto the beaches. So what's the problem right now is that we have dammed all the rivers that carry the quartz sand with them. Why have we dammed the rivers? To create great big lakes and reservoirs so we can have availability of water during the summertime or during the months when it doesn't rain. So we built a series of dams. So sand on our beach, as granitic rocks weather, so there's a lot of weak elements within the granite. There's micas, which fall apart. There's feldspars, which weather out. But quartz, silica and oxygen, very strong bond. And what happens to quartz, it simply wears down, weathers to smaller fragments, eventually sand size, and that's what is deposited by the rivers. So here's a good example of a river system entering into the Pacific Ocean. And then once that river system enters into the ocean, it's carried by the longshore current. And then generally our beaches go into a deposition mode. That means sand is being deposited on the beach during the summer from south swells. North swells in the wintertime tend to be erosive. They tend to be larger swells. They originate from the north, wintertime, and they actually cut away at the sand. Our beach is kind of limited though, because a lot of areas have these sea cliffs, so there really isn't a whole lot of area for beaches to form. And so this is a good example of what's going on in Southern California. So every one of these little blue things here is a river system that's basically flowing from the mountains to the ocean. So we have this whole series of river systems, and you'll notice there's these little larger blue things on these river systems. These larger blue things are lakes. Most of those lakes are not natural. They're there because we built a dam. And when we build dams, it does hold back the water, but it also holds back the fine-grained sediment, the quartz. So we're actually blocking that sediment from flowing out into the ocean. and then the longshore current, which will actually pick up that sand, and then the waves deposit it. So every one of the major river systems that flow into the Pacific Ocean, we have put a series of dams on those rivers. And the whole purpose of the dams is to create reservoir capacity of water. But yes, you stop the water from flowing out into the ocean, the fresh water, but you also block the sand. And this is why we're beginning to lose our beaches, because of the fact that the supply of sand has been cut off. And as a result, our beaches are beginning to erode. So sandbars, we really don't have a lot of sandbars. You go back to the Eastern United States, they have much more sandy environments. So they have huge sandbars, they have huge beaches, and the primary reason for that, excuse me, is that the topography, the land is a lot more flat. They receive a lot more rainfall on the Eastern United States, and they have a lot more river systems that are able to feed the system with the sand. The Newport Beach Peninsula is a good example of a sandbar. That's about the closest thing we have. That Newport Inglewood Fault is responsible for that, for the Newport, for the Balboa Peninsula. And so the river jetty, right where the Santa Ana River and Newport and Huntington Beach municipalities meet, right where the Santa Ana River discharges out in the Pacific Ocean, that's a good example of a river system that you would discharge into the Pacific Ocean. And prior to human development and putting dams on that river, and we have quite a few dams on the Santa Ana River, and many of its tributaries are dammed, that actually blocks the sand. So in the Eastern United States, it's actually a picture of a sandbar in the Eastern United States. Huge sandbars. They have a lot more rivers, far more rainfall, a lot more active system, and they have a very gentle slope to the coastline, and that really allows the sand to be deposited. East Coast beaches by far are far more superior, bigger beaches than we have in the Western United States. So longshore currents deposit the sand mostly in the summertime. A lot of erosion does take place in the wintertime. And so California coasts are mostly erosional due to the steep sea cliffs along the seashore. So we're not really an environment that favors beaches. So the few beaches that we do have, we should protect. Good example of a beach that disappears in the wintertime is La Jolla. This is down in San Diego. So this is what La Jolla looks like in the summertime. South swell comes in, deposits sand. But as we now move to October and into December, we see the beach starts to erode away. And eventually this whole beach is going to be rocky. The sand is going to be eroded because of the north swell. And the way this beach is orientated, it faces right at the north swell. So the south swell comes in from behind it, kind of curves around, more gentle, and deposits the sand. So they actually constructed a breakwater here. This breakwater was designed primarily to stop the north swells from eroding the beach. And it works somewhat, but if you go to the La Jolla beaches in the wintertime, the sand basically goes away, and all you have is a bunch of rock exposure. So we have a very unstable coastline. Because it's been tectonically uplifted, because it's very soft sediment, that makes it very vulnerable to erosion. And the coastal areas are then impacted by human development. We build roads, we put buildings along the coast, and that adds to the instability of our coast areas. What we tend to do is we cut out the toe of a hill. So by removing the toe, you now take all of the pressure that was once distributed across the hill, and we increase the vulnerability. So let's say I have a hill. And this is probably the single most important thing that humans do to increase the incident of erosion. So here's a natural hill. Well, what humans like to do is we like to cut out the bottom. So this is the toe. If I remove your toes, you won't be able to walk very well. In fact, our toes are a balancing part of our balance. So when I remove this toe here, take and cut it out, maybe put in a road here, now all the force that used to be along this line here, all that force, all those vector forces are pushing right against this cliff, making it very vulnerable. Then on top of that, we like to recontour these hills, so we like to take bulldozers and recontour them. You know. We can't have a natural slope because we have to put in little pads so we can build homes on these pads. Those homes then add the weight. The landscaping is going to result in groundwater seeping in, which will then act as a lubricant. So we, humans, are probably one of the most influential factors on the destabilization of our coastal areas. We basically ignore geology because we are the number one, right? We're kings, so we can do whatever we want to nature. But every now and then, nature turns around and kicks us in the back. So here's a good example of where they removed the toes, built the coast highway right along the edge there. And so this actually results in an increased incident of instability. So you can see along this coast, there's no beach. There is no sand, primarily because waves are cutting right at the rock. And because the waves are cutting on the rock, often the Pacific Coast Tideway caves in. We lose segments of it. So here's a good example. You can see that here's the Pacific Coast Tideway, and then all of a sudden it slides off this over here. And of course, what way can you stabilize areas like this? Well, you can plant trees. That always helps because trees have a root system that'll go down and they'll help to stabilize the hills. However, what do humans in California do? We plant palms, which have very shallow roots, and they're not even a tree. They're actually technically a grass. And so when they planted the palms just went wee right along for a ride. So they kind of slid right along the hill. So the reason that this eroded is because wave action is cutting away this cliff. We removed the toe, which made it far more vulnerable to erosion. And the result is that the Pacific Coast Tideway during the winter months when there's significant rainfall is often closed because of slope failure. Rockslide area, this is a perfect picture for this. So because this highway is built on very unstable terrain, because we have recontoured these hills, put in roads, cut out the toe of the hill, we've actually increased the incidence of landslides. This is an infrared photograph. Basically, everything that is green turns red. So here's an example of a home built in a very unstable area. So that added weight really helps. So up and down our coast, this is typically what you see in California. So you can go from the southern part of the state, even all the way down the Baja Peninsula. Large majority of the Baja Peninsula, because it too has been uplifted along with California. You find these very rocky shorelines where your ocean is truncated by a cliff, and of course the water is always eroding away at this shoreline, making it very unstable. And that kind of ends California coastal environments, kind of puts the end of the semester. So we have in the 105 class a final exam. In the 110 class we have a couple of labs. And the semester is slowly, or maybe quickly, I would have to say this has probably been the longest semester of our experience, even though it's been a week shorter, because they did not make up for that week we lost. So we lost some material in the process, but we just have to accommodate to what it is then. So that kind of ends the semester. As far as lectures are concerned, still have to take your final.